My name is Michael. My job at the library isn't the most exciting in the world, but it provides a steady income, and I've always loved books. However, recent events have made me rethink my feelings about this place. It all started a few weeks ago when I received a call from our library director, Mr. Griffin. He asked me to stay late to help with the inventory of new arrivals. The library was old, with massive wooden shelves and heavy velvet curtains on the windows. It was always a bit gloomy, even during the day. When I arrived in the evening, Mr. Griffin was already there. He seemed a bit nervous, but I didn't pay much attention to it. We were sorting books onto the shelves, checking lists, and talking about various small things. It seemed like it would be an ordinary night. Around midnight, Mr. Griffin decided to leave, leaving me alone. I continued working when I suddenly heard a faint rustling sound somewhere between the shelves. At first, I thought it was a mouse, but the sound repeated, becoming louder and clearer. I felt a slight chill down my spine, but decided to ignore it. As I continued working, I noticed the lights in the library began to flicker. The bulbs would dim and then brighten again, creating a strange and eerie atmosphere. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check if everything was all right with the electricity. Walking through the rows of shelves, I didn't find anything suspicious, but the rustling didn't stop. It seemed to follow me. Returning to my desk, I noticed that one of the books I had just placed on the shelf was again on the floor. It was an old, dusty book that seemed like no one had opened it in years. I picked it up and opened the first page. It had the author's name, but the ink had somehow blurred, making the letters indecipherable. Suddenly, I heard a voice, quiet and whispering. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to hide my anxiety. No one answered, but the rustling grew louder and came closer to me. I felt my heart beat faster and decided it was best to check the entire library. Maybe it was just a trick of light and shadows, or maybe someone decided to prank me. Walking between the shelves, I felt the walls closing in around me. The space was becoming narrower and darker. I tried to find the source of the sound, but it seemed omnipresent. A shadow I saw out of the corner of my eye made me freeze in place. I turned around but saw nothing. At that moment, when I returned to my desk, the lights went out again. Only the beam of my flashlight pierced the thick darkness. I felt a cold breath on my neck. Something or someone was here with me. I quickly dialed Mr. Griffin's number, but the call wouldn't go through. Panic began to take hold of me. Deciding that the best thing would be to leave the library and come back in the morning, I moved toward the exit. But the doors were locked. I distinctly remembered not locking them. While searching for the key, I heard the whisper again. This time it was clearer and more distinct. "You shouldn't have opened that book," the voice said. I turned and saw a shadow on the wall moving towards me. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The light from the flashlight suddenly went out, leaving me in complete darkness. "Do you know why this library is empty at night?" whispered the voice ever closer. "This place is cursed." I felt something cold and sticky touch my hand. I tried to fight it off, but my movements were paralyzed. The feeling of helplessness and fear overwhelmed me completely. When I finally found the key, I managed to open the door and ran outside. The cold night wind bit my face, but I was glad to be out. I looked back and saw the library standing quietly and darkly, as if nothing had happened. The next morning I returned, but didn't dare tell Mr. Griffin about everything that had happened. He just looked at me suspiciously and said he no longer needed my help on night shifts. Since then, I no longer stay at the library at night. But sometimes, when I walk past its doors, I feel something or someone watching me from the darkness between the shelves. And I know I will never forget that night when the shadows came to life. I always considered myself an ordinary student. Studying at a small college in the town of Middleton, Vermont, I spent most of my time in the library. This place was always a quiet haven where I could escape from daily problems and immerse myself in books. But one night, everything changed. It was a Wednesday, and I was preparing for an important history exam. The library, as usual, was almost empty. Only a few students wandered between the shelves, and the librarian, Mrs. Grace, sat at her desk, absorbed in some old book. I chose a spot in the far corner of the library, where it was usually the quietest. Hours flew by, and I didn't even notice how closing time approached. Mrs. Grace announced that the library would close in 15 minutes. I gathered my things and was ready to leave when I remembered that I had left my notes in the reading room on the second floor. In a hurry, I went up there, but when I returned, the entrance doors were already closed. Panic started to rise in me, but I decided that the best option was to find Mrs. Grace and ask her to open the door. I began searching for her throughout the library, but she had disappeared. No trace. Only silence and the dim light from the old lamps. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound. It was the creak of a door in the old part of the library, which was closed to visitors. I decided to check, thinking that perhaps Mrs. Grace was there. Approaching closer, I noticed that the door was slightly open. I went inside and saw long rows of old bookshelves, covered in dust. The air here was heavy and suffocating. My heart started pounding faster when I realized I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly turned around but saw no one. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I decided to go further, hoping to find an exit. As I walked between the shelves, I heard the footsteps again. Now they were closer. I stopped and turned around, but again saw no one. This was starting to scare me. Suddenly, I heard a whisper. The words were indistinguishable, but they were clearly directed at me. I decided to find the source of the sound, no matter how scary it was. As I walked between the shelves, I saw light at the end of the corridor. Approaching closer, I saw an old storage room. The door was slightly open, and soft light poured from inside. I cautiously opened the door and peeked inside. On the floor sat a girl who looked like she had been there for many years. Her face was familiar. It was Emily, a student who disappeared last year. Her eyes were empty, and her hair was disheveled. "Emily?" I asked, not believing my eyes. She raised her head and looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Help me," she said quietly. I approached closer, trying to understand what had happened to her. She was holding an old book that looked very valuable. "What happened?" I asked, sitting down next to her. "I can't find the way out," she replied. "They won't let me go." "Who are they?" I asked, puzzled. She just looked at me with horror in her eyes and whispered, "The librarians." My heart started pounding faster. I didn't understand what she meant, but her fear was real. I decided we needed to act. We had to find a way out of here together. I helped Emily get up, and we started looking for an exit from this old part of the library. Several minutes passed when I realized we were constantly returning to the same place. The corridors seemed endless, and the shelves infinite. Suddenly, we heard footsteps behind us. Turning around, I saw a shadow moving between the shelves. We started running, trying to find an exit. The footsteps grew closer, and we got more and more entangled in the maze of books. Finally, we found a door leading to the first floor. Opening it, we found ourselves in a familiar part of the library. But here a new challenge awaited us. Mrs. Grace stood by the exit, looking at us with a cold gaze. "You shouldn't have gone into the old part of the library," she said. "We're just looking for an exit," I replied, trying to hide my fear. "The exit was always here," she said, and opened the door. Emily and I quickly stepped outside, feeling the cold air engulf us. I turned to thank Mrs. Grace, but she was already gone. The library doors were closed, and silence reigned around us. After that night, I never returned to the library. Emily went missing again, and no one saw her anymore. I will always remember the horror I felt in the old part of the library. Sometimes at night, it seems I hear a whisper calling me back, but I know I will never cross that threshold again. I've always loved libraries, their quiet atmosphere, the smell of old books, and the chance to dive into a world of fantasy always drew me in. So, when I got a job as a librarian at an old library on the outskirts of our town in the USA, I was over the moon. But my joy quickly turned to fear when I realized this library harbored eerie secrets. My name is Brian, and this story happened to me last fall. I was a new employee at the library, which was built at the beginning of the 20th century. It was huge, with high ceilings and walls covered with shelves of books. Most of them were old, with yellowed pages and worn covers. But that didn't scare me. On the contrary, I was captivated by the atmosphere. The first few weeks were ordinary. I helped visitors find the books they needed, organized new arrivals, and occasionally conducted tours for school children. But one evening, when I stayed at work later than usual, something strange happened. It was already 9 in the evening, and I was about to lock up the library when I heard a strange noise. It sounded like a quiet whisper coming from the far end of the library. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I got closer, I realized they were voices. They were talking to each other, but I couldn't understand a word. I followed the sound and found it was coming from the section of old books that no one had touched for years. This part of the library was darker and colder than the rest. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and began to examine the shelves. The books were covered in dust, and at first glance nothing seemed unusual. But when I touched one of the books, the whispering suddenly stopped. A chill ran down my spine. It felt as if someone or something was watching me. I decided it was just my imagination and went back to work. But the next day it got even stranger. When I arrived at work, I saw that the books on the shelves had been rearranged. None of my colleagues could have done it, as I was the last one to leave the library yesterday. Days passed, and the situation only worsened. Every evening I heard the same whispering, and every morning I found books out of place. I started losing sleep and felt constantly exhausted. My colleagues began to notice my unhealthy appearance, but I couldn't tell them the truth, fearing they would think I was crazy. One evening, when I again stayed late at work, I decided to solve this mystery. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, I returned to that section of the library. I started recording everything, hoping to catch something on video. The whispering was louder than before, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up in fear. And suddenly I saw it. A shadow darted between the shelves. I began to chase it, but it disappeared. I checked the camera recording, but it only showed an empty space. Then I noticed one book sticking out from the shelf more than the others. I pulled it out, and a hidden passage opened before my eyes. It led to an old room that seemed to have been abandoned for many years. The room was cold, and the air was thick with dust. On the table lay old records and diaries. I began to read them, and discovered the horrifying truth. This library was built on the site of an old cemetery. During construction, workers found ancient graves, but instead of reporting it to the authorities, they just walled them up. The souls of those buried here were angry and could not find peace. They tried to communicate with the living through the books, leaving messages and moving them. I realized they wanted only one thing: peace. I decided to help them, and the next day contacted the city authorities. After lengthy negotiations, they agreed to exhume and move the remains to another location. Once this was done, the whispering stopped. The library became quiet, and I felt the fear gradually dissipate. But I will always remember that eerie whispering and those shadows that haunted me at night. And every time I pass by that old section, I feel a shiver down my spine, reminding me of the echoes of the past that have now found their peace.